this finds you well, go to the outline and let's get rolling. Today, we are going to talk about the causes of the revolution. We've spent some time talking about the different regions and how different each colonial region was and all the different components of the American identity. And now we're going to sort of put it all together and spend some time really focusing on a single question. And that question is, why did a free and affluent people fight a war for independence against the most powerful nation on earth? If you think about what the colonies had in common, one of the things they had in common was that they were younger, healthier, lived longer, more likely to own land. They were more affluent. They were more politically free than their European counterparts. It was better to be an English colonist than to be an English citizen in England, or really a schlub or even a middle-class person in any European nation. And so why is it that these people that had it, comparatively speaking, pretty well, why did these people declare their independence? They were the most politically free on earth. They had arguably the most upward mobility or class fluidity. In England, only one out of every 5 white men could vote. In the colonies, 2 out of 3 white men could vote. They were more likely to own land. I mean, all the different things we've talked about, they had it pretty well, comparatively speaking. And yet, despite all of these advantages, all of these comparative advantages, these colonies decide to declare their independence from England. Now, we're in the 1760s, and so we need to explain why that happens. But that's the question we're trying to wrestle with. So the first thing to talk about is, who is the antagonist here? The antagonist is a young King George III. King George III is 22 years old when he becomes King of England. He's 22 years old, which is very, very young. I know you don't think 22 is very young, but it's pretty young to find yourself, the king of an entire empire. And so King George III is young, and he suffers from some sort of mental illness. We're not exactly sure what he suffered from, but he did have a form of mental illness. So you might want to think of him as the Mad King, the young Mad King. Although if you watched Game of Thrones, he's not a Mad King in that sense. He suffers from some form of mental illness. He's very, very young and impetuous and immature. And that's all fine and good. But as we talk about the causes of the revolution, remember that King George III, this young, disturbed man, is basically squaring off against what you could arguably call one of the greatest, if not the greatest, generation of American politicians ever. Maybe the greatest generation of politicians, not just in America, but anywhere. George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Ben Franklin, so on and so forth. So we need to get these colonists to stop being 13 different colonies and to be one single entity. And so let's get started. And so the end of the French and Indian War is really critical here. It does a couple of things that's important for the causes of the revolution. One is that the debt caused by England's spending on that war essentially doubles England's debt. One of the ways in which they go about paying off that debt is to raise taxes throughout the empire. One of the places in the English Empire are the colonies. And so as a direct result of the French and Indian War that England fought to basically save the colonists, they are raising taxes on the entire empire, including the colonies. And that's one of the things that leads to the revolution. The other thing is that since the French now are gone, there's nothing really in the interior. There's nothing west of the colonies that sort of gave the colonists pause. And so the colonists who were a little hesitant to go west because they didn't want to run into the French and the Indians, well, now with the French being gone, the colonists are sort of spilling over the Appalachian Mountains and heading west. And England sees another problem brewing. And England goes, hold on a second. And England passes something called the Proclamation of 1763. And what that says is, hey, colonists, stop it. Don't go past this line. And what do the colonists do? They complain about it. Oh, the boot of oppression is pressing down upon the throat of freedom, and we just ignore it. So we complain and we ignore. And that's a common strategy the colonists will use. They complain about what England does and then just basically ignore it. The colonists ignore the Proclamation of 1763 while they're complaining about it. But I just wanted to mention this because this is one of the early sources of tension between the colonists and England. But I wanted to introduce you to one of my favorite historical figures, a historical figure that I think is underappreciated for his role in the American Revolution. His name is James Otis. James Otis was born in Massachusetts in 1725. He went to Harvard, became a lawyer, was a really great lawyer, a great orator, a great trial lawyer, a great public speaker, one of the great minds of his generation. He also had he had a volcanic temper, like really hot-headed, impossible to deal with once his anger got to a certain level. It was so bad that he would have one of his assistants go to court with him. And as James Otis would stand up and start speaking in court, and as his temper would grow, he he told his assistant, like as he noticed his temper getting bad, he told his assistant, when you notice my temper getting bad, tug on my coat. And so James Otis would talk, and as he was on the verge of erupting, the assistant would sort of tug, right? And James Otis would calm down. He'd start talking again, and like a pot coming to a boil, it's like, rah, and his assistant would sort of tug. And then by the third or fourth time of, the pot coming almost to a boil, then a full boil, and the guy would tug on his coat, he'd be like, will you stop tugging on my damn coat, right? He was one of those guys. Now, what we now know about James Otis is kind of like King George, the Mad King. James Otis had a mental illness. Now, his job early on was essentially working for the English government in the colonies. His job was to prosecute smugglers. Hardly the guy that you'd think is going to be one of the leaders of the vanguard of revolution. But we'll talk about his transformation. He is famous for coming up with maybe the most famous slogan in American history. Taxation without representation is tyranny. We're not exactly sure. James Otis is the one that said that. It could have very well come from Scotland a generation earlier. And you see various variations of that phrase. But James Otis is usually credited with saying taxation without representation is tyranny. We have to be careful projecting our morals backwards, our sensibilities and our values backwards. However, the powerful people, the movers and shakers, the people that lead a revolution, they know full well that slavery is bad, because every time they try to make the point that England is treating them poorly, they use the analogy of slavery. So one of the variations on taxation without representation is tyranny is taxation without representation is rule by force, and rule by force is slavery. In other words, there was a lot of people that said England is treating us like slaves because they're taxing us and we don't have a say in Parliament. Now, I'm pretty sure a slave would go, no, that's not actually slavery, that's taxation. There's a difference. But you will see this time and time again that the colonists and early Americans, when they're trying to make the point that they're being treated unfairly, they always analogize their situation to that of slavery. The writs of assistance. The writs of assistance are passed by England and applied to the colonies, and what they are is basically a general search warrant. Basically, English officers, English custom agents, English officials, they can get a writ of assistance, and what it said is that the English could search wherever they wanted for whatever they wanted, and if they broke stuff in the process of searching for something, then tough. You didn't have any recourse. And these writs of assistance, you could actually hand them off. And so the first one might be to search, some guy named Joe, but then you could take that writ of assistance and go, you know what, we want to search Steve too. And these search warrants were ill-defined. It didn't say where they were searching. It didn't say what they were searching for. And it didn't give the person being searched any recourse in, getting compensated for stuff that they broke. They are a complete violation of our sense of how things should work because we have a Fourth Amendment. And this is the origins of our Fourth Amendment. If you are a fan of our Fourth Amendment, and I am, James Otis and the writs of assistance is how we get the Fourth Amendment. So James Otis resigns and he takes up the colonial cause. He is so upset with the idea of writs of assistance that he becomes a revolutionary. He quits his job with England and he defends the colonists' rights against this writ of assistance in court. He actually gives a 5-hour speech in court. And so I hope the rest of your day is free because we're going to go through the whole thing. I'm kidding. Just a brief example, a brief sample there. I put it there. Quote, a man's home is his castle, and whilst he is quiet, he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle. This writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. Custom house officers may enter our homes when they please. We are commended to permit their entry. Their menial servants may enter, may break locks and everything in their way. And whether they break through malice or revenge, no man, no court may inquire. James Otis lost that case, but the colonists ultimately won that argument. John Adams, whose name you might have heard, the second president of the United States, John Adams was in court that day. John Adams was also from Massachusetts. He was also a lawyer. One of the ways to view this relationship between John Adams and James Otis was that James Otis was the mentor and John Adams was the mentee. And Adams said, quote, Adams said of Otis that day, quote, Otis was a flame of fire. Then and there was the first scene of the first act of the opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there the child independence was born. What John Adams is saying in his fancy 18th century words is, you want to know when the revolution began? It began on that day in court when James Otis articulated a colonial right that no other people around the world had articulated. James Otis was articulating that the colonists had a right that nobody else was arguing. So James Otis is coming up with one of the first American values. As you may recall, England's debt doubled because of the French and Indian War, and because of this debt, they raised taxes throughout the empire. The colonies, the U.S. colonies, the American colonies were part of that empire, so our taxes get raised too. They passed something called the Sugar Act, but we're not going to go through all the acts. I did want to talk about the Stamp Act, though. It was a tax on newspapers and legal documents and commercial documents and real estate documents and playing cards. Basically, any piece of paper that switched hands, you needed to put a stamp on it, and you needed to pay a tax on it. And it had to be paid in British currency, not colonial currency. And the purpose of the tax was not only to pay off the debt, but it was also to pay for the stationing of British troops in North America, because Britain left a lot of their troops because of the presence of the Native Americans on the frontier. And it's important to note that, yes, the colonists were getting taxed, but the colonists, the Stamp Act in the colonies was actually about 30% less than the rest of the English Empire. John Adams, on paying the Stamp Act, said, quote, we won't be England's slaves. Again, somebody analogizing the colonial situation and taxation with slavery. And so James Otis organizes something called the Committees of Correspondence. The Committees of Correspondence was the first organized colony-wide communication system so that each colony and people within each colony could sort of communicate with each other. I guess in a modern way, it's a group chat or a group text or, a reply all email or something like that. But it was the first time that the colonists sort of banded together for anything. And, let's not get carried away. This is not a meeting or anything. They're just exchanging information. But still, this is the first step. We're still 10, 11 years away from the colonists declaring their independence, but we're working towards it. So the colonists are beginning to cooperate with one another. James Otis publishes a pamphlet called The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. Put a couple of excerpts from it there, just to show you again, that not to belabor this point, but that the colonists knew full well, and there was plenty of colonists and colonial leaders that understood that slavery was wrong. And James Otis was one of them. The colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white and black. He also says, it is absurd to suggest that it could be right to enslave a man because he is black. Slavery is the most shocking violation of the law of nature. He says this in 1765. So when people say we shouldn't judge the past by current morality, sure, that is an excellent point. I'm a historian. I'm well aware of that. But as a historian, we also have to understand what was the sensibility of people in the 1760s. And there were plenty of people, the Quakers, James Otis, there was plenty of people that understood that slavery was wrong. And James Otis was one of them. And James Otis was one of the OGs of the American Revolution. You can argue he was the first revolutionary. Now, there's a reason why you don't know his name, and we'll talk about that later. I don't want to spoil the ending for you. So those two quotes, and then the last quote there, are not women born as free as men? All three of those quotes in a modern context are like, well, no shit. All of those quotes, right? But taken in the context of the 1760s, that is pretty impressive. But I just want you to understand that, this is not outside of the mainstream. James Otis was a mainstream thinker, and James Otis is saying these things. And this pamphlet was widely read in England. And members of parliament would talk about James Otis. Many members of parliament, would say, wow, did you see what James Otis said? And a lot of them, yeah, he's a serious guy. And other people kind of already knew that he was a bit of a hothead. And people say, he's a madman. Nobody listens to him. And one member of the English Parliament, after somebody called James Otis a madman, said, quote, "Otis is a man of consequence to the people there. It is said that he's a madman. What then? One madman often makes many." Don't you love that? I love that. One of these days, I always threaten to write a book on James Otis, and I love that quote, "One madman often makes many." So somebody has to be out there saying something crazy, and then when enough people go, you know what, that's not so crazy, then it happens. And that's one of the ways to think about the American Revolution. Some people get there faster than others, but at some point, most Americans get there. So you have James Otis, you have the committees of correspondence, and you have the first colony-wide meeting, something called the Stamp Act Congress. Really, you can argue that maybe this is the origins of the American Congress, the U.S. Congress. This is the first colony-wide meeting, and it's to discuss what to do about the Stamp Act. And one of the things they decide to do is boycott English goods, right? So we're not going to buy anything from England, and that'll teach them. It's a boycott. The other thing that happens is they unleash a group called the Sons of Liberty, which is basically a bunch of young ruffians. They would go into various establishments and harass English tax collectors, English customs agents, and would go into shops and say, boy, I hope you're not buying English products, Nice shop you got here. Shame if something happened to it, right? And so there was this high-minded rhetoric, and there was also, sort of these ruffians roaming the street threatening to tar and feather English tax collectors. And there was wide-scale colonial protests. They were called the Stamp Act protests. England called them the Stamp Act riots. They were often peaceful protests, but they were often not peaceful. I mean, I don't know how y'all think, but if you take an English customs agent or an English tax collector and you tar and feather them, well, that's not peaceful anymore. But these are arguably the most consequential protest in Western history, certainly in American history, in a long, long time. And they're protesting the Stamp Act, they're protesting England, and it's showing that these 13 colonies that are so different are coming together around a common enemy. And if you've ever played sports, right, how do you create team chemistry? One of the ways you create team chemistry is you have a bunch of people that get along and they like each other. Okay, that's great. But another way you can create team chemistry is you have a common, you all hate your coach. Right? Sometimes a great coach can create great team chemistry, but sometimes a terrible coach can really band a team together where, they're all banded together by mutual loathing of the coach. Maybe a better example that everybody's gone through is if you've ever had a job, you might not have a lot in common with your coworkers, but when you get together with your coworkers, the thing you probably talk about most is, oh, don't you hate the manager? Manager's such a jerk, right? And that your relationship is largely based on mutual dislike of a person. So if you guys are privately messaging each other, you could just go, oh, our history teacher is the worst, right? Yeah, he's the worst. And maybe I can help you make friends that way by being so bad that you have something to talk about with your classmates. So you have Stamp Act protests, or riots, depending on how you're looking at it. By the way, the Sons of Liberty, we call them patriots. England calls them thugs. It's all a matter of perspective. It's whose stuff are you breaking? If you're breaking England's stuff and you're a colonist, you're like, yeah, go Sons of Liberty. If you're an English, agent and they're breaking your stuff, well, then they're assholes, right? One of the things you can argue is that England, by trying to pay off its debt by raising taxes, but this tax in particular, basically taxing newspapers, they were taxing an entity that actually had a voice to attack the tax. Newspapers, you can publish article after article after article, and they did, criticizing the Stamp Act. And because the tax burden fell so disproportionately on the publishers of newspapers, it was those newspapers that were on the vanguard of fighting to repeal the Stamp Act. So colonial newspapers overwhelmingly supported the patriots and the colonists, and they were hated by England and English officials because, English officials were not used to being criticized, right? You don't criticize the king, but colonial newspapers criticized Parliament, criticized the king, criticized everybody. And that's the point of the press. The press is supposed to criticize. The press is supposed to hold those in power to account. I love that quote. That quote comes from the 20th century from Hugo Black, from a Supreme Court justice who said, quote, "The press was to serve the governed, not the governors." That's it, right? Presidents, members of Congress, they're supposed to dislike the free press because the whole point of a free press is that they speak truth to power. So that President Trump hates the free press means that the free press is doing its job. And our job as Americans is to make sure that we have a free press so they can continue to speak truth to power, because that's why you have them. The free press is there for us, not for them, right? The Boston Gazette, one of the first American newspapers, refused to pay the tax and changed its slogan based on the tax to say, quote, "A free press maintains the majesty of the people." Americans' love of the free press largely comes from this moment. Usually, the press criticizes those in power, and if you're in power, then you don't like that criticism. But because the colonists and the press were basically on the same side criticizing the English government, our government is founded on the idea that you need a free press because the free press was so helpful in the Revolution. Now, what specifically was the criticism that the colonists had of the Stamp Act? It was taxation, sure, but they had a more specific legalistic reason to dislike the Stamp Act. It was the idea that the Stamp Act was an internal tax. In other words, they were taxing stuff that happened just within the city of Boston or within the colony of Massachusetts or within the city of Richmond and within the colony of Virginia. And the colonists argued that legally England didn't have the right to do that. They could tax external stuff, the argument went, but not internal stuff. The other argument, as James Otis made, was that you can't have taxation without representation. Taxation without representation is tyranny. And the colonists said, look, we don't have a seat in Parliament, thus you can't tax us because we don't have a say in these taxes. Now, England goes, oh, bloody hell, what are you talking about then? That's terrible. My accents are terrible. I apologize. But England says, what do you mean no taxation without representation? 4 out of 5 white men in England couldn't vote, and the laws still apply to them. And that's not to mention non-white men and women. And so England's going, what on earth are you talking about? And the colonists had sort of evolved, had used what was happening in England as just sort of the baseline of their freedoms. And the colonists were building a superstructure on that foundation that took the freedoms that English had much, much farther. And that was this sense of, look, you have to give us a voice in the construction of laws in order for us to obey the laws. Now, there is a certain irony there, since women don't get the right to vote until 1920, and African Americans largely can't vote until 1964, 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. But those are stories for another time. Long story short, the colonists and the protests and the Sons of Liberty and the boycott and the committees of correspondence and the Stamp Act Congress, all this kind of stuff, it works. And England repeals the Stamp Act. And we talked a little about, sports and team chemistry. Well, one of the ways in which team chemistry is created is by winning. You show me a team that's winning, I'll show you a team that has pretty decent team chemistry. You show me a team that's losing, I'll show you a team that's starting to come apart at the seams. Now, it's always been an open question to me as somebody that loves sports and played team sports my whole life. I played adult baseball until I was 45 years old. I've always wondered, what comes first, the winning or the chemistry, right? Does good chemistry help you to win, or does winning create good chemistry? And the answer probably to most questions is yes, right? There's a little bit of each. Anyway, England repeals the Stamp Act. They pass something called the Declaratory Act, which says basically we repeal the Stamp Act, but we retain the power to tax you however, whenever, and whichever way we choose. But all the colonists heard was, we won, woohoo! And all of a sudden we realized, we can complain, we can, petition, we can boycott, we get a playbook here. And, if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, well, then the definition of sanity is doing the same thing and expecting the same results. Well, we had a template. What we did to combat the Stamp Act worked. England follows up the Stamp Act with the Townshend Acts, which disbands the New York State Legislature, reaffirms the writs of assistance, but most importantly for our purposes here is they tax external items like lead, paper, glass, and tea. The idea here is if England taxed external stuff that the colonists didn't actually make, the colonists would be less likely to boycott because we need these things. We can't just make these things. Other thing to keep in mind about boycotts is every time you boycott, you have to sort of, figure out a way to either make that thing that you're boycotting or find another way to get it. necessity is the mother of invention. And every time the colonists boycott, we get a little more creative about how we can make things, what we can make, and how we can procure things, how we can get things. And so after the Townshend Acts, the colonists basically follow the same kind of template. You boycott, you protest, you send the Sons of Liberty. And so the colonists follow the blueprint, follow the game plan of the Stamp Act, and they did the same thing with the Townshend Acts. Then I want to tell you a quick story. So all this is going on. Things are getting pretty tense. Boston is probably the epicenter of all this. Boston is where most of the English troops are. Boston is where, James Otis is, Sam Adams, John Adams, John Hancock. Boston is where ground zero of the American Revolution is. This is where, the true revolutionaries are. It eventually spreads to all the colonies, but it really is in Boston. And so James Otis writes a letter to the editor. Basically writes an article in the local newspaper. And in this article, he calls out an English customs agent by name and rips this guy a new one, just flames this guy. And in Boston during this time, because there were so many English soldiers, that there is two types of bars. And remember, so bars in the 18th and 19th century are not bars in the 21st century. Bars, taverns, saloons in the 18th and 19th century was where everything happened. It's where you ate, it's where you drank, it's where the hotel was, it's where meetings were, it's where the PTA meeting was. It's often where, in smaller towns where they'd have like a traveling judge, and so you get all your cases out of the way as the traveling judge came to town, and the trials would be in the tavern. It was the central meeting place. So it wasn't the same as bars today. It provided the function of a bar. It just did a lot more, right? Anyway, so there's two types of bars in Boston. One was the colonial bar, where the Sons of Liberty would go, where, you work at the dock, you get off, you go, you drink and you eat at this bar because you're going to be around friends, you're going to be around coworkers and compadres and patriots, right? The other type of bar was where the English tax collectors, soldiers, customs agents, they would hang out. And if you were an English, agent of any kind or an English soldier, you didn't go drink and eat in a colonial bar. And if you're a colonist, you didn't go drink and eat in an English bar. Why would you do that, right? Why would you do that? Well, James Otis, as I've already said, he's a little hot-headed. He has a temper. And he has some, mental issues. And so James Otis, after calling out this dude by name in the paper, goes into an English bar by himself, knowing full well that the guy probably would be there. And sure enough, the guy was there. And James Otis went in unarmed, and James Otis got the living shit beat out of him by this dude and his buddies. He got hit in the head with a sword that caused a gash and, some severe trauma to his head. And again, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people said that this was kind of the thing that caused the mental illness. Everything I read says he was on that path, and this was just sort of a B12 shot. This was an accelerant towards that end. So I just wanted to tell you. So James, and this is basically the end of James Otis's public life. James Otis, he does a little bit of legal work after this, but basically after this, he lives with members of his family, including his sister, Mercy Otis Warren, who lived in Boston. Mercy Otis Warren is a super amazing woman. She was not only the first woman to write a book on the Revolution, she was the first person to write a book on the American Revolution. And that was James Otis's sister. So quite often, James Otis would stay with his sister, and he would sit on the front porch and kind of wave at people as they went by. So that's the end of James Otis. Or is it? Or is there another story? We'll see. Hold on. The occupation of Boston. Boston was a city of about 20,000 people. It had 4,000 English troops. To put that in context, right, one of the wars of this century was Iraq. We invaded Iraq in 2003. Iraq is a country of 20 million people. To have the same ratio of American troops to Iraqis as the English did in Boston, we would have had 4 million troops in Iraq. We never had anywhere near 4 million troops. Hell, I don't think we have 4 million people in our armed services in their entirety. So there was an enormous troop presence in Boston. And this never goes well. There's a reason why we have a Third Amendment. There's a reason why until World War II, Americans always kind of were uncomfortable with a large standing army because, people don't like foreign troops to be stationed where they live. It never goes well. Even not foreign troops having, federal troops or any kind of troops in an American city, it causes tension. And so there's this enormous amount of tension in Boston. And this tension in Boston overflows on March 5th, 1770. It's called the Boston Massacre. Nobody knows exactly what happened. It was a freezing, the ground was frozen, snowy day in Boston. There were some English soldiers. There were some colonists that come out of a bar. They start saying stuff. The English start saying stuff. More English soldiers show up. More colonists show up. More English soldiers show up. More colonists show up. And at some point, we don't know who, we don't know why, but one of the English soldiers opened fire on the colonists. And while we're never fully sure why they do it, we know that 5 colonists perish and 8 colonists are wounded in what is called the Boston Massacre. And the colonists are horrified by this. By the time the news hits all 13 colonies, colonies are apoplectic about this. And the easiest thing in the world would have been to find these English soldiers guilty and to hang them from the highest tree. Easiest thing, the colonists wanted vengeance. But John Adams, God bless him, John Adams went, no, they deserve a fair trial. Remember when we were talking about the rule of law? The rule of law is not the presence of laws. The rule of law is the idea that the law applies to everybody equally. And that includes English soldiers who had just killed 5 colonists and wounded 8 more in a skirmish. John Adams walked the walk. It's one thing to say it, law and order. Well, that's great. You can say law and order, but do you believe it? No, you don't. You can say it, but do you talk the talk, but do you walk the walk? No. John Adams walked the walk. John Adams represented them and got them off, basically. And this is one of the great moments. This is called living your values. We don't just, there's a lot of ways in which we say we're about this or that, and we don't live up to it. Occasionally, though, we do live up to it. And in this instant, even before we were a country, John Adams walks the walk, gives them their fair day in court, and they are found mostly not guilty. And even the ones that are found guilty, nobody is executed. But this is really like a wake-up call for the colonists and England. England's like, oh boy, things are getting a little hot over there. Let's cool everything down. We can make this work. Because remember, England is not just, we talk about England did this, right? As if a nation of millions of people is just one entity. England is the parliament. England is the king. England is also the English middle class that are making a ton of money, right? The colonists and the English middle class, importing, exporting, buying, selling, trading, they're making a ton of money. And as far as the English middle class goes, it's like, will you stop poking the colonists? Can't we all just make a ton of money and get on with our lives? Parliament, too, was like, we can make this work. It was the king that was like, oh, he was the hothead. And so everybody decides to kind of ease off. England repeals all the taxes except for the tax on tea, because there's a tax on tea. If you know anything as an American, you know that we have a tea party, right? The French Revolution had the Reign of Terror, and we have the Tea Party. And the Tea Party, look, I think most of you know the Schoolhouse Rock version, but there's a couple interesting aspects of it that we should be aware of. So let's go through it a little bit. So England had repealed most of the taxes except for the tea tax. Look, I don't want to get too deep in the woods with, the England's policies towards taxing tea, but just understand that England sort of recalibrated how they, their tea trade. And in this recalibration, it's still English tea, it is still taxed, and yet it is arriving at the colonies, and the colonists are able to purchase this tea at a lower price than they had previously. And so one of the things that had happened before England changes, how they exported tea, was that colonists, they were faced with 2 options. They could buy the tea that was taxed by England at a certain level, or they could buy tea that was smuggled in by smugglers. And the smuggled tea was cheaper than the taxed tea. And so most colonists bought the smuggled tea. Now, can you say that the colonists who buy the smuggled tea are committing a political act? Maybe. Sometimes the right thing is also the cheaper thing. Sometimes. And so maybe they were doing it for the right reason. Maybe they were trying to prove their point that they didn't believe in English taxation by buying the smuggled tea. But I'm guessing a lot of people just went, yeah, but it's cheaper too. Sometimes the principled thing and the cheap thing are the same things, but often you have to make a sacrifice. And so for a while, the colonists didn't have to make a sacrifice. They can make a political statement and save money. But when England changes how they export tea, then the price of the taxed tea goes below the tax of the smuggled tea. I know. It's the most boring thing in the world to talk about the relative tax rate on tea. But my point is, it gets to the point where it's actually cheaper for the colonists to buy the taxed tea than the smuggled tea. And yet, most colonists continue to buy the smuggled tea because now they're making a principled point. Does that make sense? This is when you don't start to see it, but you start to see a greater flowering of this idea of a creation of an American identity. You saw it all the way back to the 17th century. You really saw it during the French and Indian War. And the concrete is beginning to firm up here. And this idea that, maybe we're not English colonists, maybe we are Americans. And so there's still this tax tea. There's still this tax on the tea. Colonists are still pissed off about the tax. And so one day in 1773, Sam Adams leads a bunch of poorly costumed colonists onto ships in Boston Harbor to basically make a political statement and throw the tea into Boston Harbor. When they throw the tea into Boston Harbor, they're making a political statement. What I want you to understand is that there are numerous examples of the colonists, while they're dumping the tea into Boston Harbor, they are careful not to, break anything on the ship, to break the locks, to break the cases that the tea was held in. If they made a mess, they cleaned it up because they wanted to make sure that that people saw this as a political act and not just an act of vandalism. And there was even a case of somebody going back the next day and fixing something they had broken. Now, what's funny about that is somebody goes back in broad daylight to fix something they had broke during the Boston Tea Party, and yet nobody managed to figure out who did the Boston Tea Party. Interesting, right? This Boston Tea Party horrifies England. England is like, look, we look at it as a principled political statement. England looks at it as vandalism, right? England looks at it as, you just destroyed property. In the mind of the English, it's no different than taking, a shipload of iPhones and throwing the iPhones into Boston Harbor. You're out all that money. We view it as a political act. England views it as a willful destruction of property act. And based on this, now after the Boston Massacre, England was like, yeesh, let's kind of cool things down a little bit. After the Boston Tea Party, England was like, you know what? Screw you. And England passes 4 pieces of legislation: the Quartern Act, the Boston Port Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Massachusetts Government Act. Collectively, the colonists call them the Intolerable Acts, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious that England would never call, nobody would pass legislation and call it, these are the Intolerable Acts because you're going to hate these. No, those are the actual names. We call them the Intolerable Acts. And one of the things to think about is, so we talked about the origins of the Fourth Amendment. By the way, so John Adams was there in court that day that James Otis argued against the writs of assistance. When the revolution is over and we win, I know, sorry, spoiler alert, each state writes their own constitution. And John Adams wrote the Massachusetts Constitution. And the Massachusetts Constitution had the strongest protection of privacy out of all 13 colonies. And so when James Madison writes the Bill of Rights in 1790, he takes almost word for word what John Adams had wrote that protects privacy, and that becomes our Fourth Amendment. So James Otis articulates the notion of privacy against the writs of assistance in court against the English. John Adams was there, absorbs that. That comes out on the page with the Massachusetts Constitution. James Madison takes that, and that becomes our Fourth Amendment. So you can argue fairly compellingly that James Otis is the father of our Fourth Amendment. One of the origins of our Third Amendment comes from 2 things. One, the Quartern Act here in the Intolerable Acts. What the Quartern Act says is, look, you colonists have to house our troops. We have troops there, and you have to put them up in your house, and you have to feed them your food. The other place that the Third Amendment comes from is the French and Indian War, when the English came over to help fight the French and the Indians, and the English basically commandeered colonial homes. And so these 2 things are sticking in the mind of James Madison when he writes the Bill of Rights. And that's why we get the Third Amendment. Anyway, the idea behind the Intolerable Acts is that mainly the rebellion's coming from Boston. It's from Massachusetts. It's not colony-wide. It's just Massachusetts. We're going to make an example out of them. And what they don't fully realize is they don't make an example out of Massachusetts. They make a martyr out of Massachusetts. You know what a martyr is? It's sort of like all of a sudden now the other colonies are sympathizing with Massachusetts, right? Their heart goes out to them. It's like, oh man, can you believe how terribly Massachusetts is getting treated? Oh man, right? And so rather than make an example, they make a martyr out of Massachusetts. And this is yet another example of the creation of an American identity. Things are getting real now. Nobody is quite saying just yet that there's going to be a revolution, but things are getting real. Shots are about to be fired. And we'll talk about those shots and the revolution itself starting next time. But for now, that's it. And until next time, I'm History.